Welcome to Shad's Guitar Show. Whether it's the gear or the players who made the gear famous, this podcast is about all things guitar. Well, hey there, and welcome into this episode of Shad's Guitar Show. As always, I am Shad Worrell, your host. Glad to be with you here. And I wanted to do the next few episodes as sort of a series on offset guitars. I've always been a huge fan of offset guitars, and in fact, the Jazzmaster has, for many, many years, been my favorite guitar design. But lately, I've really developed a love for the Jaguar as well. So anyway, I want to talk over the next few episodes about the Jazzmaster, the Jaguar, and the Mustang. Some of the design philosophies, why Leo created these designs, and really just kind of get into what's useful about these guitars, who they might be for, and, just kind of dig into what they are and whether or not it might be something interesting to you. Now, you may already be a huge fan of offset guitars, or, maybe you've known about them, heard about them, but really never experienced them much. So hopefully you'll learn some things about these designs and these guitars, and it might encourage you to check them out further yourself. And you might find that you really love them as well. All right, so let's kick off the first episode in the Offset series with the original, which is the Fender Jazzmaster. Now, in order to get started, we have to go way back in time to 1958. But before we get into the Jazzmaster, I want to talk a little bit about Fender guitars as a whole. So at this point, Leo Fender was absolutely riding high on great success. The Telecaster was doing phenomenally well, as was the Stratocaster, the Precision Bass, the Jazz Bass, the amplifier line, the pedal steel line. You could say that, he really hadn't had any kind of a miss yet. Everything he had designed and put out there, players were really embracing. It was a great time for Leo, and I think that confidence is one of the reasons that as we get into this, we will learn that the Jazzmaster ultimately wasn't the success he intended. Now, up to this point, Leo had always been able to kind of test pilot his guitars with working musicians. Now, there was a huge music scene, Western swing and country around the Southern California area. Lots of clubs where people would go to dance and hear music. And Leo would often frequent these venues and meet with the guitar players in these bands and basically shove a Telecaster or a Strat in their hands and say, play this, tell me what you think. And in that way, he was able to get really instant feedback from professional guitar players as to what they liked about the guitar, what didn't work for them, and he could then make adjustments kind of, in real time, which was great for him. But with the Jazzmaster, he kind of envisioned himself entering into a whole new world of players, which was the jazz guitarist. Now, at the time, jazz guitar was primarily centered on the East Coast, in particular in New York. And that was like a world away from where Leo was, all the way over here in Orange County, California, on the coast. So I think one of the biggest problems that Leo had, especially not being a player, is that he wasn't really able to get the guitar into the hands of its intended audience to hear what they thought about it. And Leo ultimately was an engineer and designer. He was not a musician. So in his mind, when he was building the things he was building, it was with the intention of creating something that worked better for whoever it was that was going to be using it. So with the Jazzmaster, I think Leo was trying to solve problems that in his mind he thought may have existed, but the reality is for jazz guitar players, those issues weren't there. I mean, at the end of the day, the jazz guys were not complaining about their hollow body guitars. Their ES-175, Super 400s, whatever fully hollow big jazz guitars they were playing, they didn't have any issues with them. They were working just fine, and there were no problems for Leo to really solve for these guys. And what that ultimately led to is the complete and utter failure of the Jazzmaster to connect with its intended audience, the jazz guitar players. Now, you can see once in a while a photo from that era of a jazz guy playing one of these guitars. There's the famous photo of Joe Pass playing both a Jaguar and a Jazzmaster. But ultimately, this was sort of a novelty. It never caught on. No jazz guitar player ever ditched their hollow body to grab a Jazzmaster and, make that their main guitar. So it was, at that point, Leo's real first failure to hit a home run with a design. But fortunately for Leo, a new genre of music would appear on the scene very shortly after the Jazzmaster came out, and that was surf music. You had the Ventures, you had Dick Dale, you had the Beach Boys, and numerous other bands that would come along and create this new sound. And the Jazzmaster was tailor-made for that sound. You know, that bright, percussive kind of sound, tons of reverb, the new vibrato, or as Leo called it, the tremolo that he had designed was perfect for those really nice, subtle, chords where you get that nice wobble. And it was just the perfect guitar for that sound. So even though it hadn't connected with jazz guys, there was a ray of hope for the Jazzmaster because it was widely embraced by this new surf genre. Unfortunately, the surf thing didn't last all that long because in the mid 60s, you had the British invasion, and basically the Beatles took over the world, and the Beatles were not playing Jazzmasters. So everybody's focus shifted to different guitars, and the Jazzmaster kind of waned and sank into obscurity, and it would stay there for quite a while. And it wasn't until maybe the late 70s into the 80s when a lot of the early punk rock pioneers, the early alternative bands would embrace these guitars. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that you could get them really cheap. Now, I'm sure a lot of these guys would have preferred to have a Strat or Telecaster at the time, but relatively speaking, those were more expensive. And you could find an old Jazzmaster, in a pawn shop for a couple $100s. And I think as these guys began to use the guitars, they realized that not only were they affordable, but they actually were really cool. And there was a lot of little idiosyncrasies about the Jazzmaster that made it really, really work well for the music that was being made then for these guys. And then as you move into the early 90s, you had shoegaze music, which was, again, another short-lived genre, but absolutely every band in that genre was using a Jazzmaster or a Jaguar. Those guitars were tailor-made for that sound as well. And, even to this day, a lot of indie and alternative artists are really enamored with the sound and look and feel, and just overall vibe of the offset guitars, the Jazzmaster in particular. So you still see them all the time. It is not what you would call the most popular guitar out there. Obviously, when you look at Fender, I would venture to say that the Stratocaster is by far, not only for Fender, but guitars worldwide, is the most popular design ever and probably the best-selling guitar in the world. And the Jazzmaster is way down the list in terms of, most popular guitars. But it does have a really solid following that's been there for a long time. And people who love them will always love them and really appreciate some of the things about the Jazzmaster that make them really unique and special. Okay, so let's jump a little bit into the design. Let's go back again to 58, which it was when the guitar was designed. Now, the original ones were exactly the way you see them now. The body design has never really changed. The original 58s had a gold guard, and they had a maple neck with a rosewood fretboard. They were using the barrel style knobs that you see on Telecasters, and it was just a really kind of space age looking guitar at the time when you looked at all the switches, just the way the guitar was designed. And when we talk about the offset body, that wasn't just an aesthetic choice that Leo made to say, hey, let's make something look this way. It actually, going back to what we were talking about earlier, where Leo was really an engineer and a designer at heart, he realized that jazz guitarists, again, that was the intended audience, they often played, or most of the time played, sitting down. And when you sit down with a Jazzmaster, it has sort of a forward lean to it, which makes it very comfortable to play seated. If you've ever played a Les Paul or a lot of Gibson guitars, when you sit with it, it almost kind of wants to fall off your right leg, or if you're left-handed, your left leg kind of backwards. It's sort of back heavy. So by shifting things forward, Leo made the guitar incredibly comfortable to play in a seated position, which he thought would be one of the many things that jazz guitarists would embrace. So the theory is definitely sound and it does work, but, again, just not something that jazz guys were looking for. But anyway, that's the kind of the story behind the body design. Now, when we look at the tremolo system, it was night and day different than the Strat setup. It's basically a plate, there's a spring underneath, and it has this floating, subtle quality to it that people who love Jazzmasters particularly love them for that reason. You can get very, very subtle, pitch variations. You don't have to be so immediate. When you use a Strat or other kinds of tremolo systems, you have to be, it's kind of more, it's just a different feel. The Jazzmaster is very smooth, and it's almost like if you could imagine driving down, the street in a, 50s Cadillac where it just kind of floats and, the shocks are moving and the car's just kind of, floating in a way. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of how I envision it in my mind. And that's how that trem system works. It's really, really cool. And one of my favorite things about the Jazzmaster by far. Leo thought this would appeal to jazz guys. Again, it didn't, but it has appealed to every, player who has embraced the Jazzmaster and remains one of the biggest selling features for a Jazzmaster. Okay, so let's talk about the pickups. And this is one of the biggest things that I've seen over the years is people look at the pickups and at first glance, they assume that those are P90s, like what you would find in, a Gibson. Well, they are absolutely night and day different designs. So think about it in this way. If you were to take a Strat pickup and flatten it, drive over it with a car and flatten it down flat. So now it was the same thing, but just much wider. That's exactly what a Jazzmaster pickup is. It's a single coil with rod magnets, just like a Strat pickup. It's just way wider and way thinner. And what this does is when you wind the pickup, the wire that goes around the coil ultimately goes out further from the magnets, and it creates a much wider magnetic field. And that's what gives the Jazzmaster sort of its almost high fidelity, three-dimensional sound, is that wide magnetic field. That also can be problematic for noise in some instances, but it is really a great design, and it does lend itself to some very, very great sounds. Now, in addition to the pickups, Leo also switched from using the 250K pots that he was using in the Telecaster and Stratocaster to 1 meg pots. And that allows a lot more treble frequency to pass through the circuit, giving it a much brighter tone and just a lot more dimension. So that also was a departure and gives the Jazzmaster a really, really unique tone. Now let's talk about the switches. And it's kind of hard to do without looking at it, but in your mind, you can imagine it. So the 3-way toggle switch that you see on the lower horn is exactly what you expect it to be. It switches from the bridge pickup, and in the middle it gives you both pickups, and in the forward position it gives you the neck, just like any other 3 toggle switch type guitar. But you'll also notice on the pickguard at the top horn there is a little slider switch. Now when you slide that switch to the up position, it now sends the signal through that upper or rhythm circuit. And those little roller wheels you see, one is volume and one is tone. The huge difference here is that the potentiometers in the lead circuit below, as we talked about, are 1 meg potentiometers, where on the rhythm circuit, they're 50K potentiometers. So if we know that a 1 meg potentiometer lets lots of brightness and treble through, then a 50K we know is going to let very little treble through. So it's going to be very dark and bassy sounding. And Leo thought that would be perfect for jazz guys because, as we know, especially in that era, jazz guitar was not like a bright sounding thing. It was very warm and, I don't want to say dark, but you know what I'm saying. It had a warmth and it wasn't real present. It was very smooth sounding, and Leo was after that sound. So he thought, well, they could switch up to the rhythm circuit, and then they would be able to get great rhythm tones. Then they could go into the lead circuit below if they wanted to play solos and sort of cut through the mix better. And one other thing to note, when you're in the rhythm circuit with the switch up, only the neck pickup works. So the lower toggle switch at that point is taken out of the circuit and it doesn't do anything. So you're only in the rhythm circuit, you're only using the neck pickup. And one other thing, I think just because of the design of the guitar, people think that it may have an extended scale length. It is 25.5-inch scale length, exactly the same as the Telecaster or Stratocaster. So no difference in the scale length of the guitar, though it does obviously look like a bigger guitar. All right, so let's walk through the evolution of the design. Let's keep it to the golden years, which I would say is through the mid to late 1960s. So as we talked about, in 1958, the Jazzmaster hits the scene. It's got the gold pickguard. In 1959, things remain relatively unchanged, though we do see in mid-59 the gold guard go away and the tortoiseshell pickguard will now enter the scene, and that is what we see as the main guard all throughout the golden era of the Jazzmaster. Now, the design, other than the neck thickness, varies a little bit throughout the early 60s, but really the design stays the same from 58 all the way to 1965. In 1965, we see Leo selling the company to CBS, and in that time, we see that the neck gets binding added, but retains the dots, although the dots at that time will go from cream dot or clay dots rather to mother of pearl dots. The tuners at this time through 58 through 67 were the vintage style Calusin tuners that we're all familiar with, though in 67 they would move to the F-stamped tuners on the back, which were a slightly different design. All right, now 1966 is where we see the mother of pearl dots on the fretboard go away and replaced by mother of pearl block inlays, which would now be standard on the Jazzmaster. Also to note that in around November of 65, we see the headstock shape get larger during the CBS era, and that would also be the case for the 1966 and onward. But aside from some of these, fairly subtle changes, the overall design of the Jazzmaster has never changed throughout its entire history. Now, there have been some different signature models for artists that have deviated a bit from the classic design, but never really in the shape of the guitar or the overall look and feel of the guitar. And throughout its early history, the Jazzmaster was never a top seller, and its sales fluctuated especially throughout the 70s when, people's tastes in music was changing to a point where the Jazzmaster just wasn't an option that most people would consider. So in 1980, Fender officially discontinued the model. Now, it wouldn't be until 1986 that Fender Japan would resurrect the Jazzmaster in the form of some vintage reissue models. And that would ultimately lead to Fender USA doing their own run of reissue models, most notably the 1962 reissue and the 1965 reissue. And they've done variations throughout the Fender line, all the way from the Squier vintage modified guitars, all the way up to the Fender Custom Shop, who does recreations of some of the vintage models as well. So it remains a solid seller and a very popular guitar, albeit with a much smaller audience than that of the Telecaster or Stratocaster. But for those of us who love Jazzmasters and offset guitars in general, it will always be a guitar that's incredibly close to our hearts. All right, so that about does it for this, kind of cursory glance at the Jazzmaster and sort of what it is and why you might be interested in one. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell your friends about it. I'd love to grow the show and get more people listening. So if you're able to give me a like or a comment or a review or anything you can do to promote the show, that would be super helpful and welcomed. And I'm looking forward to continuing this offset series very soon with an episode on the next offset guitar in the Fender catalog, which is the Fender Jaguar. So I hope you'll come back and join me for that. And until then, grab a guitar and make some music. And I'll see you next time.